lecture in memory of Dadaji. Only for 2 years, in 2020 and 21, due to the COVID pandemic, we held the function through a special webinar. The pandemic has led to a new normal with some valuable additions, which we really value, like the special webcasts, which led many more of us to join live beyond the auditorium from across India and the world. Keeping this larger audience in mind, this year we are holding the function physically at IIC, as well as via a special hybrid platform linked live on the YouTube channel CFTV News Reports. For the 27th lecture, we all, my parents, Suhas and Sudha, me and my family, and my younger sister Girija with her family are here to welcome you. We begin the program by presenting Angvastrams to today's panelists. These Angvastrams are called Ganga Jamuna and have come from Salem in Tamil Nadu. These Ganga Jamuna Angvastrams represent our plural and secular traditions, to which all our artisans from across the country are deeply wedded to. Also, there's a small memento of the 27th DSB lecture. Can I request the Borker family to present the Angvastrams and the small memento of this lecture? My mother, Sudha Borker, to present the Angvastram and memento to Dr. Harish Khare, who's the chair. Can we have a little... My father, Suhas Borker, to present the Angvastram and memento to Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta. My sister, Girija Borker, to present the Angvastram and memento to Ms. Chitrangada Choudhury. And now, can I request the grandchildren of the Borker family, Avya, Adipat, and Ridya, to present planters to our honored guests. Now, can I request Girija to please escort our panelists to the stage? We shall light the lamp and begin the proceedings. I have the privileged opportunity to introduce Chitrangada Choudhury. Chitrangada shall be introducing the 27th DS Borker Memorial Lecture, the speaker, Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta, the chair, Dr. Harish Khare. Chitrangada, a very warm welcome to today's panel. comprising the most prominent public intellectuals of our time. I think what ties together today's panel is the unwavering belief in deliberation, debate, critique of power structures, and commitment to diversity. All the panelists write, speak, and question without fear. This encapsulates the spirit of not only this lecture series, but also the India one aspires to be a part of in 2047. An inclusive India defined by the principles of equality, justice, and dignity, where Tagore's words would resonate loudly, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free and the words come out from the depth of truth. A resolute believer in the spirit, I greatly look forward to today's lecture. Chitrangada Choudhury is a celebrated journalist, a documentary filmmaker, and an academic. She was a part of the founding team of People's Archive of Rural India and is on the editorial board of Article 14. She holds an undergraduate degree in history from St. Stephen's College and has been a Fulbright Nehru Fellow at Columbia University and a Knight Wallace Journalism Fellow at the University of Michigan. She is currently a PhD candidate in geography at the University of Zurich. Chitrangada began her journalistic career with the Indian Express Bombay in 2004 and has since worked with the Hindustan Times and the Guardian in the United States. Over the past 2 decades, Chitrangada has particularly focused on ground reportage from forested mineral-rich belt of central eastern India, including her home state, Odisha, on how Adivasi and forest-dependent communities are being dispossessed in the name of development and economic growth. Her reports have won national and international reporting awards, including the Sanskriti Foundation Award in 2008, the Press Council of India National Award for Investigative Reporting in 2016, the Lorenzo Natali Journalism Prize in 2010 and 2018. Chitrangada has also been a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies and the Institute of Rural Management in Anand, and an associate professor of practice at Khare University. That's a long list of laurels. Chitrangada's recent documentary film, Seed Stories, in 2024, chronicles agroecological change in Odisha's Nyamgiri Mountains to raise larger questions about caste, power, knowledge in an era of ecological collapse. The documentary, apart from being shown at the IIC, has been screened at several festivals in Kolkata and Torino and at several educational and other institutions in India, US, Italy, Switzerland, and the UK. Over to you, Chitrangada, and greatly looking forward.
A warm welcome to all of you, and let me just start by thanking Suhasji, Sudhaji, Haim, Girija, and the entire Borker family for this privilege and honor of providing the introduction today. So my vision of India 2047 AD, the DS Borker Memorial Lecture Series, is moving relentlessly towards 2047. Today is the 27th lecture. There are 22 years to go until 2047, when we will achieve 100 years of independence, and that shall be the 49th lecture in the series. A civil society initiative instituted in 1999, the lecture is held in the memory of DS Borker, a civil servant and public sector administrator, every year on August 24th here at the India International Center. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as the physical function at IIC could not be held in 2020 and 2021, the lectures were delivered via special webinars. And in the past 3 years, the lecture is being held physically at IIC and linked live via a special hybrid platform on the YouTube channel CFTV News. Mr. Borker, or Nath to friends, was a civil servant, a public sector administrator, a strong advocate of physical education for India, a proponent of the idea of play streets in Indian cities, a secular democrat, a man who was always ready to stand up for the poor and the weak, and above all, someone known for his humane approach and his simplicity. Mr. Borker was by all accounts a brilliant civil servant who contributed enormously to public policy and governance during his long stint in public life. The large crowds that his lecture attracts every year here at IIC and online are an eloquent testimony to his qualities of head and heart. Mr. Borker was born in Bombay on 17th August 1911. He had his early education in the city, and then he went to England for his further studies. Upon India's independence, he joined as the private secretary to Mr. N.V. Gadgil, who was a member of Jawaharlal Nehru's first Union cabinet, and he worked with great dedication and sincerity of purpose. He was in the thick of many things, so as to say, is there a photo? Yes. So here is a rare photo of Mr. Borker with Sardar Patel alighting from a Dakota at the Jodhpur airport on 25th January 1949, and he can be seen at the top of the aircraft ladder. There is an incident pertaining to the post-partition period when Delhi was still in the throes of communal riots, and which is particularly poignant in these times that we're living in right now, and which is recorded by Mr. N.V. Gadgil in his memoirs, which we would like to mention here. Mr. Gadgil writes, DSP saved the life of Hussain Imam, ex-chairman, Council of State, member of the Constituent Assembly from Bihar, and a member of the Working Committee, and the Central Parliamentary Board of the All India Muslim League and a close associate of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. He saved the life of Hussain Imam from desperate mobs and personally escorted him to Safdarjung Airport and put him on a plane to Patna. This happened on 8 September 1947, and he did this at great risk to his own life. Such was his commitment to the values he held dear. Mr. Borker had varied interests in life, particularly physical education. In 1940, George Allen and Unwin London published his book, Physical Education for India. This book is kept in the rare section of the Bodleian Library, University of Oxford, from where it has been sourced by the family. In this book, he fervently appealed for creating a fitter nation. Through the book and articles in leading newspapers, he also advocated the innovative idea of play streets, by which he wanted certain streets during specific hours of the day to be closed down to vehicular traffic so as to enable children to play on the thoroughfares, an experiment which was tried with success in some cities of UK. This scheme mentioned in Mr. Borker's book was appreciated through the editorial columns of the Times of India of 7th May 1940. His contribution also brought him honor and recognition, and he was India's first delegate to the World Congress of Physical Education, held in Stockholm in November 1939. He also received the Ling Gold Medal from the King of Sweden. When the temples of modern India, as they were called, were being planned and built, Mr. DS Borker was working in the Planning Commission's Committee on Planned Projects. He also worked in several public sector organizations, including Hindustan Steel, where he was the first officer to join, and later in the State Trading Corporation, Fertilizers Corporation, and Engineers India. A versatile personality indeed, the Borker family can legitimately feel proud of these accomplishments of Mr. DS Borker. Now, the idea behind the DS Borker Memorial Lecture Series, titled My Vision of India in 2047 AD, is to strengthen our secular and democratic values and traditions, and to encourage a process of thinking about the kind of India we want in 2047, 100 years after our independence from colonialism. This series is unique in that it has consistently showcased ideas and forward-looking agendas, often contrarian ideas and agendas across a remarkable spectrum. And when you see the number of the people who have delivered this lecture, that is manifestly clear. And they remind us that debate is such an intrinsic and invaluable part of building a democratic and secular India. Mr. DS Borker's two sons, Shekhar Borker and Suhas Borker, had initiated this lecture series in 1999. Mr. Shekhar Borker passed away in January 2015, and this shall be the 10th time the lecture is being held without him. Speaking on the 25th Memorial Day of Mr. Borker, while delivering the 6th lecture in 2004, Mr. K.R. Narayanan, the former President of India, said, Shri Borker was a remarkable public servant. Very few public servants have such lectures instituted in their names in Delhi. This is a tribute to his ideas, to his identity with the larger causes of India, and to his great intellect and sympathy for people and their problems. He said, I want to pay tribute to this remarkable public servant who made an impact on this somewhat skeptical capital, which is Delhi, and this impact has been lasting. This now brings us to this year's lecture, which will be delivered today by Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta and chaired by Dr. Harish Khare. Both are very well known, I'm sure, to many of you in the room and need no introduction, but I shall perform the duty I've been asked to do. So our speaker, Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta, is an acclaimed academic, writer, and public intellectual. He's the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University. He was the Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University and the former President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. After graduating with a BA in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics from Oxford and a PhD in Politics from Princeton, Professor Mehta has taught at Harvard University, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and the New York University School of Law, and more recently as a distinguished visiting professor at BML Munjal University. He's the recipient of the Infosys Prize, the Adeshesh Prize, and the Amartya Sen Prize. And as a scholar, he has not refrained from public interventions. He has served on several central government committees, including India's National Security Advisory Board, the Prime Minister of India's National Knowledge Commission, and a Supreme Court-appointed committee on elections in India's universities. He has published widely in his areas of research, which include political theory, intellectual history, constitutional law, politics and society in India, governance, political economy, and international affairs. He's an editorial consultant to the Indian Express, and his columns have appeared in dailies, including the Financial Times, the Telegraph, the International Herald Tribune, and the Hindu. He's also on the editorial board of many academic journals, including the American Political Science Review, the Journal of Democracy, and India and Global Affairs. To the trustees of the DS Borker Memorial Foundation, Professor Mehta was the ideal choice to deliver the 27th Memorial Lecture and to push ahead the process of thinking regarding the India we want in 2047. There are three reasons for this. Firstly, his extraordinary contribution as a leading public intellectual in defending our Constitution and the fundamental values enshrined in it. Secondly, his seminal interventions in bringing to the fore our concerns regarding the decline in our institutional mechanisms to safeguard the interests of minorities, Dalits, and Adivasis, mechanisms which are most critical for our survival as a secular democracy. And finally, as our country passes through trying times, Professor Mehta's firmly standing up to challenge prevailing narratives made him the ideal choice to deliver today's lecture. I will briefly introduce Dr. Harish Khare, our chair for this evening. Dr. Harish Khare is one of the most eminent journalists of the country. He has had an illustrious career in journalism for over 48 years. He's known for his incisive political analysis with a sharp and independent perspective. His editorial leadership is recognized for his staunch advocacy for journalistic integrity and transparency. He did his PhD in political science from Yale University. Dr. Khare was the resident editor of the Times of India in Ahmedabad for over 15 years. He also worked as the resident editor and chief of bureau with the Hindu here in New Delhi. He served as the media advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh from 2009 to 2012. In 2012, he was awarded the Jawaharlal Nehru Fellowship for his project, Governing India in the 21st Century, Reinventing Nehruvian Executive Leadership. He was later the editor-in-chief of the Tribune Group of Publications from 2015 until 2018. His writing all through has been characterized by a critical examination of power structures, often challenging the establishment's narratives. And this evening reminds us of the 2005 DS Borker lecture when the speaker was sandwiched between two journalists. That year, exactly 20 years ago, the well-known activist and leader of the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, Aruna Roy, was delivering the lecture. Prabhash Joshi, the veteran journalist, was the chair, and Pamela Philippos, the then associate editor of the Indian Express, was doing the introduction. So ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you to what promises to be a very thought-provoking and introspective and engaging evening. And now I would request Professor Mehta to deliver the 27th DS Borker Memorial Lecture, My Vision of India 2047. Thank you, Professor.
I'm deeply grateful to the Borker family for giving me this undeserved honor, and I think the only reason I accepted to do it was I hope I'm inspired by DS Borker's exemplariness in some ways. We need that exemplariness in our political, administrative, and public lives. This was a very difficult lecture for me to think about. One, because of the occasion. Second, because 26 distinguished speakers before me have outlined a vision of India 2047, and what can I possibly add to them that is of any value. In fact, you feel quite small when you see the grandness of their visions or hear about it. But it was also a difficult lecture because every version of this talk that I came up with was basically not more than a 2-minute talk or lecture, right? So the first one was, if somebody asked you, what is your vision of India 2047? Where do you want India to be? I'll bracket for a moment the question, why should my vision even matter? It's not an entirely academic question, I'll come to it later. Right? But somebody said, give an elevator pitch, to use the contemporary jargon, as it were. Right? So the first one that always comes to my mind, in a sense, what ought to be the cornerstone of this civilization, the advice given by King Rantidev in Mahabharata. Right? I'm sure all of you know it, but it is astonishing how much we've forgotten it. Na tvam kame rajyam, na swarg, na punarjanam, kame duktaptanam praninam, artinashnam, right? I don't desire a kingdom, I don't desire heaven, I don't desire salvation. All we want is all life to be relieved of suffering, right? This can't be surpassed. If you say what you want from India in 2047, this is it. And the question for us is, why is this obvious cornerstone value of this thing we called India? If somebody were to say, what is your idea of India? This is my idea of India. This has always been the idea of India. Why is it that a civilization that can produce this thought at its center also produces the extraordinary cruelty, mutilation of human possibilities, and hierarchies of our social life? And roughly, if we can crack that riddle, we've got India 2047. So that was the one short version of the lecture. What can one say? Right? The second short version of the lecture, not my vision, but a lot of our fellow citizens believe in it, so we should take it seriously, was very simple. In 2047, we will have a great leader who will just declare India developed and Viksit, and that's that. Right? As simple as that. Right? That's also a vision, by the way. Right? It's not a non-vision. It's not a vision some of us share, but it is a vision. The third version of India 2047 was the preamble of the Constitution. Right? The three most significant words in modern political vocabulary: liberty, equality, fraternity. Right? Again, what more can one add to those three extraordinary words and their mutually reinforcing effects? They're normatively interlinked. You actually cannot have liberty without political equality. Right? And you cannot have either without some form of mutual regard or concern. So that was my dilemma, right? India 2047, what else? Right? Now we could do something else. We could do elaborate 100-page PowerPoints on Vision India 2047, right? A Niti Aayog kind of document, right? Or even worse, you could do a McKinsey kind of document. You name the vision, I'll give it to you, right? Right? This reminds me of, sorry to joke on this solemn occasion, but sometimes it is revealing. I was in a meeting once And it was actually, the World Bank was involved, since there are people from the World Bank here, with a bunch of people from government. And the World Bank was pressing the government on gender equality as a target, right? For some particular scheme. How will you ensure gender inclusion? And at one point, a secretary, one of the secretaries of the government said, tell me how much gender you want, I'll give it to you, right? So, Vision 2047, right? But jokes aside, I mean, you know, I think the first couple of visions are serious ones, and I don't think that could be surpassed. This occasion led me to reflect on this particular moment that we are in and how that might relate to a vision of 2047. So, another way of entering this subject, if I were to speak very personally, and today I'll be speaking personally in some ways. This is not an academic lecture. Think of it as a monkey bath, hopefully a little more entertaining. But another version of this, I was thinking about this. What are the things that I hate most about political and public life? And I started listing them, and I said, look, 2047 can be the eradication of those things. Crushing, debilitating deprivation of material circumstances and poverty is one. And that is one thing I suppose almost everybody agrees on, even if we don't agree on how to get there. But the other things that we hate most about our collective political life, Vision India 2047, war, or the prospect of war, is making a big comeback. Communalism, the targeting of people simply for being who they are, is making a big comeback. Authoritarianism, third big thing I hate, making a big comeback. And increasingly, ecological devastation of a scale that is unimaginable, making a comeback, right? So all the four big things that we thought in our lifetimes, last 20, 25 years, right? When the end of history, in a sense, was bending towards some kind of equilibrium or justice. All these things that we all viscerally hate most are actually coming back and becoming powerful. And not only becoming powerful, we are actually in a vicious cycle of politics. It's almost like quicksand, where every strategy we resolve to resist them seems to end up strengthening these very evils that we are trying to resist. Right? So another way I could define this Vision 2047 is, how can we prevent wars, fight back authoritarianism, absolutely squash communalism, right? And so forth. But that led me to think that there's actually an even deeper challenge at the moment. And it's perhaps not a challenge that many of my predecessors in this podium, who are much more distinguished, learned, wiser than I am, had to face. And that challenge is the following. One of the characteristics of this present moment, set aside the politics, set aside your view of the world, which party you belong to. But one of the challenges of this moment is the almost total collapse of the possibility of meaning in communication. Right? I'm sure many of you have had this experience, even if you're not on social media. Right? But think of the experience of writing or saying anything at this moment. Right? First of all, Derrida's view of communication has won out. The sign is always indeterminate. Every act of communication is systematically an act of miscommunication. Right? It's literally true now. Right? Almost everything you read, you actually don't know, in a sense, what determinate meaning or context in which to place in. Part of this is systemic, it's global. There's a complete collapse of context in communication. Right? One of the preconditions of any form of communication, two preconditions, right? One is sincerity, that you're attributing a certain kind of sincerity to the speaker, that they're saying this in good faith, they will defend their claims in good faith, right? With a certain internal integrity to the logic of their argument. Because if you don't attribute sincerity to a speaker, no communication is possible, right? Then it's all some other motive. As my JNU faculty colleagues used to say at some point, there are no texts, there are only subtexts, right? So sincerity is one of the preconditions of communication, and it is certainly a precondition for creating a collective civic life in common. We can have our differences. God knows we should, right? But if, in a sense, every act of utterance, every speech act, is either construed as insincere or liable to systemic miscommunication, try and think of how you might actually build a common civic life or a common civic world. Even before we get to the question of what should be done. Right? So one of the existential challenges we face as a democracy, one of the things we hope doesn't exist in 2047, right, is that we have been able to restore the conditions of basic civic communication that are absolutely central to a democracy. Without a shared stock of facts, without a presumptive faith in each other's intentions, right, without a public sphere that is construed by the validity of arguments, all democratic and civic life collapses. So the challenge for democracy comes even one step before we actually get to which party we should vote for and so forth. So I would say, look, maybe one of the things we need to talk about much more frankly, Vision 2047, is not what our objectives are. I think we can certainly get this room to agree what they are, right? Perhaps not even about the means to get there, which I'll come to in a second. But the nihilism that we face at this moment is far deeper and far more profound. Right? And I said that's the quicksand quality to it. Right? Now, many of you might be thinking, very rightly so, this is a thought I have about myself. I'm occupying the stage. In my vision, India 2047, I mean, first of all, why should my vision be of any interest? In a democracy, absolutely every single person's vision is of interest. Nobody has any presumptive authority over anybody else, right? And why should somebody like me, perhaps many of us in this room, who are part of that ultimately self-legitimating circle of IIC well-wishers, right? Why should our word carry any credibility, interest, or weight at all? And I think somebody who asked this question is asking exactly the right question, right? Which is, what is, in a sense, the point of this discussion or this vision, right? It goes to, I think, the point that I was trying to make first in a philosophical way about the impossibility of communication and the nihilism that comes within it in our times, right? Is the complete collapse of exemplariness and credibility, right? One of the reasons it's important to remember people like Mr. Borker is if they had power, any power at all, or if there is any political leader, any intellectual who's had any influence on power, it has been in part because of their exemplariness. Most moral and political learning does not work by, right, receiving instruction. I'm always very amused when we have these vigorous debates over syllabi. I mean, if you want to turn students off something, put it in the syllabi, right? What we learn from, in a sense, is actually a certain kind of exemplariness. Where does all moral change come from? a certain kind of exemplariness where people start putting a presumptive trust in some people, right? That was Gandhi's success. Dare I say, that was Jawaharlal Nehru's biggest success. I mean, he's an extraordinary politician, not because he got people to agree with him, right? He actually mostly spoke above people's heads. But he managed to create that exemplary alchemy of trust. Right? And one of the questions we'll have to think about, if you're thinking in a sense about moral change, about political change, right, is the collapse of moral exemplarity in our society, right? I mean, that's also part of that nihilism and cynicism, right? You give me any name, any leader, any person, I can deconstruct their reputation in 2.5 minutes, right? And any society that is bereft of that kind of character, I know character is not a word modernists like, it's supposedly belongs to some ancient philosophies, maybe Aristotle. But any society has to ask this question, if it's to look forward to a vision of 2047. What kind of characters do you want this society to be full of? Certainly characters full of civic courage, hopefully lots and lots of sense of humor. I hope a lightness of being, right? This town is too full of people, सीने में जलन, आँखों में तूफान सा क्यों है? That's our existential. You want a certain levity in civic life, public life, right? And certain baseline commitments, one of which is you do not target anyone for being who they are. Right? But most importantly, like Mr. Borker, having the civic courage to, in a sense, stand behind those commitments. Otherwise, anything we say here, anything we discuss here, right? Your reaction will be exactly the reaction you have to Niti Aayog's Viksit Bharat 2047 report, right? It's a report on demand. And unfortunately, in a sense, that's where we are. So let me get on to something a bit more substantive, and this is kind of, as I said, venting my own kind of anxieties about both this task and this moment. I also must confess a certain degree of discomfort with the mandate that was given to me in these lectures. And again, I'll air that discomfort out, not as a settled argument, but again to think of how do we get through these comforts to get to 2047. There were 3 words given in the invitation that I received. Right? Secular, progressive, and democratic. Right? Values Mr. Borker stood by. And at one level, right, these are values, I suppose I would say I stand by. But I must confess, I'm deeply uncomfortable with 2 of those words. And again, let me kind of first do the negative case and then we'll move on, right? I'm deeply uncomfortable with the word secular. I understand the political valence of that term in a country like India, particularly when it is used as a shorthand for anti-communal, right? Understand its significance. I understand its significance as a political philosopher, where you say that one of the characteristics of a mature public sphere, of a mature democracy, is that our public reason should be secular, based on reasons we can all share in some ways, right? Those kind of shorthand terms, I understand the word secular. But I'm uncomfortable with the word secular because one, as we know historically, the distinction between what is the religious and secular is itself internal to the rise of sovereign power. It is not given antecedently. You cannot delineate that distinction without first delineating what the conception of justice is of the state. And it's a distinction internal to that conception of sovereign power. Its meaning is not self-evident. What is secular? It's actually the most kind of obscure word in the term. Second, as we know, secularism, while it might, in a sense, keep the peace in some ways, it is also deeply compatible with a certain kind of communalism. There's a version of secularism that imagines India as a federation of communities, different communities having created a consociational arrangement, right, to respect each other qua communities. I must confess, that's a version of secularism I'm deeply uncomfortable with. I want India to be a zone of individual freedom, not a federation of communities. There will be diversity. Diversity is never a freestanding value, but the genuine diversity will be one that comes out of the free choices of individuals, not negotiated settlements between communities. Right? So, because Indian secularism has been so associated, and in fact, one of the tragedies of modern history is that the only genuinely secular position, which is the liberal position, was always considered the communal position in India. Right? I'm deeply uncomfortable with the word secularism. And I'm also uncomfortable with the word secular because I know people will have their own beliefs, should, that's the beauty of the civilization, but I think any civilization that banishes the possibility that we might not be the ground of our own being will be an impoverished civilization. So I'd much rather talk about liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yes, there are boundaries around those concepts that are fuzzy, but they represent substantive values that honor the moral dignity of the individual in a way in which I don't think secularism can or does. I'm even more uncomfortable with the word progressive. Right? Actually, again, there's a shorthand quotidian meaning of progressive that I could readily sign on to. That's progressive basically means anybody working for a slightly more just world, right? Anybody standing for liberty, equality, fraternity might be progressive. But again, the content of progressive will be actually cashed out in terms of the substantive values as defined. As a freestanding word, it has actually no meaning in some ways. But I also worry about progressivism, or progressive. Self-identification is progressive. We know the age of progress is also the age of mass murder. Who is to actually say that the pinnacles of our civilization are better than the pinnacles of any other? And I'm just going to lay my cards on the table. The other thing I worry about progress is its association with progressives. Right? My intellectual development was shaped by two very different kinds of books. One is, of course, the Mahabharata, which is the kind of ur-text of all India. The other was my PhD dissertation on the Scottish Enlightenment and the unlikely figure of Adam Smith. And the two meta themes that I learned from that, which has made me very suspicious of the idea of progressive as an aspiration, is progress can happen. The possibility of progress is a precondition of our thinking and acting at all. Even those who deny the possibility of progress act as if something better were possible, right? That's a generic transcendental argument. But when we think of social progress, I actually tend to think that societies grow rather than are engineered, as many progressives have thought for a long time. I think social causality is incredibly complex. And one of the things I worry about progressives, particularly in India, is the kind of will to simplicity, right? You take one principle, argue it to its, in a sense, logical conclusion, right? Progressivism as an aspiration can often be accompanied by a deep lack of social self-knowledge, where it is easy to judge and desecrate lots of established institutions because they're imperfect in one way or the other, without actually recognizing their latent functions sometimes, right? And without actually holding oneself responsible to the rule that if we are going to dissent and rebel, it has to be, as George Eliot said, in the name of a higher rule. Not just a higher rule, but in the name of full political responsibility that what we are going to bring about will be better than what we have. And I think there's a kind of easy desecration in progressivism, too much condescension of posterity in some ways, right? That I actually, in some sense, worry about, that will to simplicity. That lack of, in a sense, social self-knowledge. And so one of the things we hope in 2047 we have is a society that has a much more complex sense of social self-knowledge, its own representation of its own working, is not hostage to engineering metaphors, willful simplicities of social science, right? Or simple first principles. If liberalism means anything as a social philosophy, it actually means moderation, but it also means a taste for complexity. As the Mahabharata and Adam Smith tell you in different ways, lots of bad people often end up producing good results. Lots of good people produce horrendous consequences in political life. So fundamentally, political life is not about theoretical knowledge or visions. It is about that very rare virtue, judgment. All things considered judgment, not other things being equal judgment. Most progressive political argument, like most social science argument, operates in this register of other things being equal. Most social life is all things considered. I must confess, that makes me conservative with a small c. Right? But I actually think it's absolutely necessary to rescue progressivism from a kind of will to simplicity. It is particularly important, I think, in one area, which is going to be absolutely vital to India's Vision 2047, which is India's economic success. Absolutely everybody in this room agrees, I think will agree, that the most crushing blot still on India, right, is the absolutely intolerable levels of material deprivation and poverty that still exist, right? Material poverty is central to dignity in some ways. I mean, anybody who denies that is putting their head in the sand, right? And one of our great colossal failures since 1947, one of the trysts with destiny that we have left completely unfulfilled, is the creation of a viable economic model that can aim at inclusive prosperity. Right? Now, we can diagnose why that is the case. Some will say it's corruption. Some will say it's democracy. I don't quite believe it's democracy, although there's one version of the argument. I'll come to it in a second. Right? But one of the things that has stood in the way of achieving what should be actually a relatively easy task. It's easy in the sense that at least there's social consensus on that's what we want. Right? In a way, there isn't consensus on secularism or national identity. In my view, This is CPR days, maybe too jaded being an anthropologist of the state. The corruption story is the easy story. It's visible. It's one everybody talks about. But one of the most astonishing things about India is how difficult it is for us to engage in practices of collective problem solving. Right? I mean, you just have to go to an RWA meeting, right? Relatively homogeneous community, maybe 25 members, right? Right? I mean, when Amartya Sen said Indians are argumentative, we should take argumentative as an insult. It's not a badge of honor. Because argumentative means somebody who goes on arguing even after the matter is settled and the facts have been presented. Right? But the more serious version of this is democracy will survive in part because people pay allegiance to its basic principles, liberty, equality, fraternity, the procedural safeguards that comes with it. But in part, democracy can survive only if democracy as a mode of governance is seen to be solving particular existential problems that people have. Right? If you do not have a job, if you do not have drains in your city, if you cannot walk freely, throwing democratic procedure at people is not going to work. Democracy in danger as an argument is not going to work unless liberals demonstrate a capacity for governance. And by governance, I simply mean the capacity to solve the problems of collective life. Now, one of the things we have to think about when we talk of solving the problems of collective life is what are the structures of negotiation that enable that kind of problem solving to be institutionalized in a democracy. The romance of democracy, and this is not just a problem for India, this is global in some senses. Global democracy is in crisis. India is not sui generis. The romance of democracy is that it's an open society where we can experiment, learn from our mistakes. To use Tocqueville's famous phrase, in democracy you make retrievable mistakes. Very nice slogan, except if at some point says, well, if you keep making the same mistakes over and over again, what's the point of saying it's retrievable mistakes? Right? There was a basic structure of democracy we took for granted. That structure had two principles, or rather three principles. One is, of course, the constitutional values I talked about, liberty, equality, fraternity as moral lodestars. An institutional structure based on the separation of powers, a range of powers allocated across various branches of government. And the second mechanism was electoral party competition. Right? Modern democracies have been premised on the idea that party-based electoral competition, right, is the best way in the long run of checking arbitrary power, checking concentrations of power, and for allowing the kinds of experiments, restoring of balance in democracy that we need from time to time. One of the big challenges we're going to face, Vision 2047, is this model of democracy is completely on its last legs. Okay. Why do I say this? Not simply because there are particular authoritarian and communal forces that are out to destroy this model. That's all transparent, that's easy to identify. But the reason it's a global crisis, a near global crisis, is for the following reason. This democracy is premised on two internally inconsistent logics. And those internally inconsistent logics are tearing it apart. On the one hand is the logic of principles, institutions, and procedures on which those institutions are based. Parliament, judiciaries, you name all of it. All of you know them, right? On the other hand is the principle of party competition, right? Now, if you think about it for 2 minutes, we used to think the principle of party competition will be contained within the larger framework of proceduralism and constitutional values, right? That's the framework within which the principle of party competition works. But it turns out the principle of party competition has its own logic. Its own logic is that it is partisan all the way down. Parliaments and legislatures across the world are practically defunct, because parliament cannot survive extreme partisanship, right? Once it becomes clear that the purpose of politics is to create partisan majorities and to do whatever it takes to create those partisan majorities, right? What truth you believe in, which argument you will find salient, right? It's a way of kind of, in a sense, reducing argument to partisan identity. So the structure of partisan politics, by its very nature, that's what makes it partisan. Right? You can't say I'm a congressman and then say 50 times, I think my party is wrong on X, Y, and Z. It's the logic of the system. It's not about individual act, right? Similarly, it's true of the BJP. So the logic of partisanship is in deep tension with the logic of mutuality and collective action. And I think this is the fundamental, when we think of constitutions, right? I mean, in a way, the separation of powers that we all talk about from the days of Montesquieu onwards is dead in the water once partisanship becomes the defining feature of democracy. And so one of the things we want in 2047 is a new institutional imagination that actually unlocks this contradiction that we are in even thinking about the basic institutions of modern democracy. And I don't think this contradiction is going to go away with one change of government or something else, right? So on the kind of next, now, there's two things I want to, in a sense, say in closing, and this hopefully is a more affirmative vision part. I tend to be by nature skeptical. True faith is always skeptical. I'll put my cards on the table. They're already on the table. I don't think anything more needs to be said than saying just concentrate on the meaning of the three terms: liberty, equality, fraternity. I am a liberal and have no hesitation identifying as such. It's a much abused word. Probably the most abused word in modern Indian intellectual history. Everybody thinks of it as a pejorative. But the one aspect of liberalism which I cherish most, in a sense, is its moral individualism. The sanctity and dignity of each individual and the creation of conditions where every single individual is allowed the freest and fullest possibilities for their self-development on their own terms. Right? One of the things liberalism requires, and this is one thing I will wish for 2047, is the erasure of any form of compulsory identity. Right? If I were to give you two tests for the health of Indian democracy in 2047, and the health of Indian society, the economic test would be very simple. The economic test would be, are we economically developed enough such that domestic servants become completely unaffordable and extinct as an economic species in India? That's a simple test for where we are, in a sense, on the wage curve. In terms of civic consciousness, the simple test. Identities matter to people. They should be freely chosen. But the tyranny of compulsory identities, which has characterized Indian social life in terms of caste and religion, and it's the tyranny of compulsory identities, not the importance of identities. They're two different things. Tyranny of compulsory identity means these identities are legislated in law, as we are about to do even more with caste, creating literally a rule of caste in law, right? Again, for ostensibly progressive ends. The attribution of scripts to individuals because they are members of particular communities. That's the tyranny of a compulsory identity that you cannot escape, right? So the individual morally liberated from the tyranny of compulsory identities. You pass these two tests, and I would be pretty confident that Indian society will be safe in 2047. Okay? But here are the two unfinished projects that I want to talk about. So I'm mindful of time. I'll wrap this up very quickly. When I was thinking of Vision 2047, it's always good to go back to what our founding fathers and mothers, the great nationalist movement, thought. Although I have to say that I think that nationalist movement has also become a fetter around our neck. I have to say this absolute obsession with defending Nehru, Gandhi, Ambedkar. They were thinkers, they were thinking in their time, they were thinking their own thoughts. If modern India simply becomes an exegesis of their thoughts, it'll stop thinking. And frankly, it has very little resonance amongst young people, right? It displays more a bankruptcy of exemplars, right? Nehru is big enough, his reputation will survive, doesn't matter, right? But there were two projects that were very dear to that generation, which we have lost sight of. And that's what I want to what's a collective project we move towards besides the usual constitutional pieties and economic growth. The first project was India was emerging out of colonial rule, and it had to create the conditions for its own independence and self-determination. It had to create a position in the world system where it would no longer be exploited, it would no longer face asymmetries of power, and with some luck, if India got its story right, it could itself become a model and exemplar from the world. Right? Now, what happened to that project? First thing that happened to that project, and I think it is worth reiterating this at this moment, global politics is at a conjuncture where we are back in a days that remind you of late 18th, 19th century imperial projects. And the shocking thing about India is exactly as vulnerable as it was in the 19th century if we are not careful. Right? We have absolutely no material presence on the world stage. 4% of global trade in services, 2% of goods trade in commodities, right? 140 on the Human Development Index, right? That itself makes you vulnerable in unprecedented ways, right? So the unfinished task of decolonization, that India becomes the node through which a world order is created that is just and fairer. And an important node in that story is India's development. That story is the weakest it has been, actually, in some senses. Right? So that anti-imperial project. But that anti-imperial project was premised on two beliefs. The first, this will be probably the most controversial thing I'll say tonight. The first was the strategic unity of the subcontinent. Okay? If colonialism was, in a sense, a setback to the idea of India, desecrated the idea of India, made India abject, right? Mutilated it in so many ways. Right? I would submit in hindsight, so did partition. Now, I'm not going to advocate, and it's not going to happen, and it's not possible, and perhaps not even desirable, Akhand Bharat visions of 2047. Separate nation states have been formed in the subcontinent for good or for ill. Those nation states matter to the people that inhabit those nation states. Right? Those barriers have been built up over the last 75 years. They're not going to come down. But the mistake that India is making, and a profound mistake, is that the anti-imperial project and the project of the domestic regeneration of politics is not going to be possible if we don't imagine South Asia as a unified strategic and moral space. Okay? We will be subject to imperial vulnerabilities precisely because South Asia is not a unified strategic space. Our entire paranoia and anxiety stems from that one single fact, right? And every thinking that Indians did till 1947 was premised on the strategic unity of the subcontinent, right? Right? Our worry about great power meddling, right? Our worry about asymmetric warfare. So unless South Asia is imagined as a strategic unity, and you create the conditions for the political, in some senses, strategic unity of South India, or South Asia, India is going to be vulnerable. That strategic unity of South Asia, Vision 2047, is not going to come if we do not radically alter the terms of political discourse in all our countries. So, 1947, we had this illusion that partition is a modus vivendi. Pakistan can do whatever it wants, Bangladesh, post-1977, what you want. India will be different. First of all, India is in the process of fulfilling the logic of 1947 in ways that are going to be horrific, ones that we cannot even contemplate. But the logic that made 1947 possible, which is the benchmarking of religious identities, South Asia will have to be reimagined as a zone of individual freedom, not as an area that emerged out of the negotiation between communities. That negotiation is self-defeating, always going to be unstable, and always going to be fertile ground for internal and external division. Right? So let me submit, this is the controversy, this is Vision 2047, the restoration of South Asia to its strategic and moral unity, imagined as a zone of freedom and able to act collectively to ward off imperial powers rather than encourage them. And that will open up the space for what I think is the big project of the national movement, the last final thought. So when we think of the condition of colonialism, colonialism was, as many of you know, an astonishing epistemic rupture in India, right? The terms in which a society understood itself, its mode of social self-knowledge, were entirely delegitimized, right? Some of that delegitimization was inevitable. That's the fate of anybody who loses in politics. Ideas actually chase power in some senses as much as anything else, right? Some of that delegitimization was inevitable because we came to realize the decrepitude of our own social arrangements. How could we say this is a society of Buddha and Rantidev when you actually looked at the mutilation of the human spirit that India represented. Absolutely perfectly understandable, right? So for example, the attack on caste as a form of social self-knowledge, alas, still very incomplete, right? But think of the deeper consequences of that delegitimization, where an entire civilizational sensibility, spiritual, philosophical, logics, aesthetics, forms of knowledge, language, right? Absolutely all of it became the object of suspicion. It had to, in a sense, prove itself, right? If not completely desecrated. And I often use this analogy, and I say this again. Anybody who talks about Indian civilization at this moment, right? Anybody, and whether the left, the right, the center, with the most benign intention. That image the late Alasdair MacIntyre gives in the beginning of After Virtue, of what it means to be a civilization in ruin, right? Imagine you have got scraps of texts from this civilization, right? Lots and lots of them, most of them still unread. But you have lost a sense of the entire context that made them intelligible, right? It's like you've got textbooks of philosophy of science, but you don't know what's the science they're referring to, right? Which is why, for example, in philosophy in contemporary India, we can do only history of philosophy. We really don't do philosophy, right? The sense of intellectual ruin of a civilization, right? You pick up any modern book written on Kabir. In 2 minutes, you know it's a book on social theory. It's not a book on Kabir. The reason it's not a book on Kabir is the minute you hear Ida, Pingala, Sukhman, everybody goes, what's that? Right? So this was a civilization in all its complexities and differences. Each one of them, this doesn't just apply to one culture, one interpretation, completely in a state of self-ruin, where the intellectual conditions of its intelligibility completely disappear, right? After independence, those intellectual conditions of intelligibility disappear even more for 3 reasons. 3 legitimate reasons. One, as I said, was the social question. We know all civilizations are both texts of civilization and texts of barbarism. It's true of every civilization, right? The Greeks are the greatest harbingers of liberty as they are of slavery. Right? It's true of every civilization. I think India is one of the few that post-independence, wittingly or unwittingly, took the view that all that is true of Indian civilization is just power all the way down, right? The question of civilization is reduced to the question of what structures of power do these texts encode? Indian philosophy is of interest only because what structures of power does it encode? And again, absolutely legitimate critique. Every civilization has to answer for its oppressions. Every text has to be deconstructed for its logic of oppression. But I cannot think of any other intellectual culture that so whole-scalely and persuasively used that as an argument to completely discard the whole thing. It actually discarded its own possibilities of transcendence. That hermeneutics of suspicion, that deconstruction. The second suspicion, again justified, was, yeah, this civilization was all great and everything, but ultimately what was it? Wasn't it just the planetary granary of spiritual narcissism? Right? Isn't that what all that good stuff amounted to? Right? People busily saving their own souls? Right? That was, in a sense, the revolution modern reformers tried to bring about, right? And that charge struck close to home. Actually, there was truth to it. Right? what's the point of saving your soul if the whole world is in a sense, being damned, right? In a democratic society, the suspicion that any set of philosophies, any set of texts that have a perfectionist logic to them, right, will come under suspicion, right? So we are all spiritual narcissists. The opposite of spiritual narcissism is some kind of engagement in civic life. And the third and final, and we could have survived even these two challenges. At least they were legitimate critiques. The third and final challenge is what we face right now, which is the colonization of this civilization by something called Hindutva and Hindu nationalism. It's the single biggest assault on this civilization, far worse than colonialism. The reason it's the single biggest assault is because it shares with its adversary one premise, which is all texts have to be texts of power. Right? It wants to reduce the civilization to an ethnic identity. Right? Simply a benchmark, gar se kaho hum Hindu hai. Right? Like Marxists and the left, it actually believes that that civilization had no spiritual core. Or the spiritual core it had is the one that needs to be discarded. Rantidev, Buddha, Gandhi, come on. Seriously? The only measure of that civilization has got to be the currency of power. If the left wants to use power to deconstruct that civilization, this ideology wants to, in a sense, use that civilization simply for one and namely power. Right? It's the single most important. Now, what in a sense happens to moral and spiritual life in a civilization that loses all forms of self-knowledge? The only thing it encounters is either a blanket quest for power or a completely suspicious hermeneutic of deconstruction. Right? Now, hasti mitti nahi hamari, everybody says, that is India, goes on. It's a nice comforting thought. Hamari hasti baar-baar mitti hai. Politics mein baar-baar mitti hai. Right? The only place where it doesn't seem, only two places where it doesn't seem to disappear, interestingly, is one is the realm of culture. It's a glorious time to be alive for Indian classical music, for example. Right? It's just not going to go away, the depth, right? It also doesn't seem to affect one of the most marvelous things about India, right? Which is this incredible power to diffuse divinity in literally everything, right? There's actually something joyous and miraculous about India in that respect. And I hope India 2047 doesn't give that up, right? Under these new mortal gods that we are worshipping, right? But that intellectual project, right, which is how does a civilization confront the consciousness of its own ruin? In so intellectual ruin, spiritual ruin, in so many different ways. Will we in 2047 have a better answer to that question? That answer can come only, again, this is true of every civilization, the simple secret of all civilization, which is the word spiritual is very popular in India, everywhere. And people like to say, particularly in these gatherings, we are not religious, we are spiritual, right? And again, I have the same response that I have to India Vision 2047. Very nice. What does spiritual mean? Spiritual simply means to be able to observe and act on the world in the most objective manner possible. Science is the most spiritual of endeavors, as Max Weber pointed out. Because if you're a true scientist, you have to extinguish your ego. Right? And so if we are asking the question, what kind of citizen is going to help build India Vision 2047, part of that answer will be spiritual. But not spiritual in the sense of spiritual cults, right? Not spiritual in the sense of worship of gurus, but spiritual in its core sense, what does it mean to comprehend the universe objectively? The three magical words of this civilization, Sat, Chit, Anand. Sat is reality more than truth. The great idea of this civilization, putting consciousness at the center of all philosophical inquiry. And Anand, the availability of the state of bliss. So, if Sat Chit Anand seems closer in 2047, we will have done our job. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mehta, for such a deep and unsettling address. I would request everybody to please give a standing ovation to Professor Mehta. I would now request Dr. Harish Khare to offer his remarks as the chair.
Professor Harold Bloom of my university, Yale, was one of the most original, provocative literary critic of last 40, 50 years. And he has a book called, one of the books, title was, Where Shall Wisdom Be Found? In India, if this question has to be asked, the answer is Professor Bhanu Mehta. And I think he has fully validated the reputation which is attributed to him of being India's leading intellectual voice. And I think it's fair to say he provides many of us the coordinates how to navigate this very complex times in our journey as a nation. I don't, because what Professor Mehta has said was so profound and so complex and so, there were, as I counted, there were 3,424 themes. But I mean, this is a, if visions are so complex, I am not very sure that, but I, as a chair, I think I have a very simple, if my vision was asked, I have a simple vision. I don't have a vision, I have an experience. And the experience is from when I was a student at Yale University. And part of my fellowship was that I had to perform some what we in India would call menial jobs. And one of the jobs was that the hostel we lived in, and there were no telephones at that time, so direct lines. There was a mini telephone exchange. You have to be at the reception, monitor it, and somebody call can be connected to the individual rooms. So, and if you do the night job, the payment was double the hourly rate. So I always used to opt for the, what was called the very, very late night shift, which means from 3 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock in the morning. And every morning at 6 o'clock, the janitor would come precisely on the dot at 6 o'clock. And he would park his car outside. One could see through the glass. And he will come wearing a suit, doesn't matter what time of the season he was, and wearing a hat and wearing a tie. And he would come and stand at my counter, the exchange counter, and he will take out a cigar. And those days I used to also smoke cigars, so we'll share a cigar. And then for next 10, 15 minutes, this gentleman would give his opinion, unafraid, unintimidated that he's talking to a Yale graduate student. He'll talk about and then at 6:30, precisely, he would retreat and go to his closet. And I didn't want to mention that he was a black gentleman. So to someone coming from, the unequal society that is Bharat, it was a profound impression on my mind that one day could we in India create conditions where anybody would be able to express himself or herself on an equal footing to anybody. And the two verbs which in Mr. Mehta's lecture appear repeatedly, think and imagine. Think of this and imagine of this. Now, both are, loaded with agencies of individualism, a kind of social equality, which have eluded us and more regressively. Now we think it's part of our national regeneration, and the path to national glory would lie in a certain kind of conformity. Demands are made on in different names that you are not entitled to think for yourself. We will tell you what to think. And this is I'm a 1947 born, post-independent person. So 100 years after for me, it would be that we have a society in which everybody is free to think, free to express himself, free to have an opinion, unencumbered by hierarchy, by fear of authority, by social stratification, and by any kind of economic inequality. So I think what Professor Mehta has outlined, he's probably left everybody very confused as precisely what kind of, if he was to write again, Niti Aayog was to tell him, sir, give us 5 PowerPoints. I am sure he will not be able to do that. But nonetheless, he deserves our collective thanks and compliments for being so erudite and so thought-provoking and so willing to challenge even what would be the canons of liberal orthodoxy, because he is the high chief priest of liberalism in India, had the honorary position. So we are grateful to him, and it's wonderful that we are having this kind of lecture. A society which does not know how to listen, how to respect men and women of ideas, is honors intellectuals, is not a progressive, not progressive in the sense of Mehta Sahab sort of decoded, but forward-lookingness. So compliments to Suhash and the family for having this wonderful tradition of inviting prominent voices who would diagnose for us what is wrong with us and how we can, in some way, cure ourselves of our collective maladies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harish ji, for your remarks. It's now my job to sum up before we close and offer brief remarks. I wanted to thank Professor Mehta for raising at the very outset and then repeatedly reminding us through the lecture, I think, which is one of India's most stark failures, which is the widespread condition of material deprivation. And Dr. Uma Chakravarti last year, when she offered her remarks as the chair, said that when I think about India 2047, I would like to imagine a country where every Indian has enough to eat. And I think the fact that we have not managed to do that is really like a cause of shame, but also the point, Professor Mehta, which you raised about the comeback of ecological collapse. I'm not so sure if it's so much of a comeback as really, again, one of our most serious challenges, and the fact that I think the whole question of economic inequality has, in a way, become depoliticized in this current political moment of intense identity conflicts, is linked to the fact that we have, through the past 20 years, really commodified so many forms of nature and non-human life, and our disregard for that is also linked to this extreme economic inequality that we are seeing right now, with really so much wealth concentrated at the top, and a lot of that flows from the commodification of nature. I wanted to end on a hopeful note, and also taking up Professor Mehta's reminder to us that this is in some ways a self-referencing world of the ISC auditorium, and also drawing inspiration from Haim's very moving opening remarks, to remind a lot of us, and maybe many of us in this room do not need reminders, that so many young Indians in their 20s and 30s are now in prison, behind bars, students, cultural activists, gender activists, Dalits and Adivasi rights activists, environmental defenders. And in 2047, they will be in their 40s or 50s. And as Justice A.P. Shah very movingly said in his lecture, which I think he had given a couple of years ago, maybe their experience of what Professor Mehta very powerfully called the mutilation of human possibilities, they're spending their youth in prison. When they reach 2047, their experience of this kind of really like the criminalization of dissent, of speaking up, of civic courage, will lead them to foreground the concerns of the marginalized, which we seem to have forgotten. It will lead them, as Justice A.P. Shah said, to build a more just, kind, compassionate government and society. And I would like to end by recounting the example of one young person an environmental defender from Maharashtra who's now spent 7 years in prison as an under trial without bail. And he was granted bail 2 years ago by the Bombay High Court, but the Supreme Court has not heard that appeal now in 2 years, the appeal against the stay. But that's not the whole story of this young Indian. Behind prison, he's studying to be a lawyer. Through a note he had sent me through his relative last year, he said, "I'm still filled with hopes and dreams." So on that note of indomitable courage, human dignity, I would request you all to stand up for the national anthem.
जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे
Thank you all.